And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Dr. William Oddie from England, the other side of the ocean. He's come to visit with us to talk about his work as an author, working on books related to the church. Welcome, Dr. Oddie, to EWTN's Bookmark. It's great to have you here on this show.
It's good to be here.
It's good to see you again in person. People will remember you were on the journey home with Marcus Grodi, and you and I actually had the pleasure of meeting very briefly at Littlemore in Oxford, where we did an interview back then on your book, The Roman Option, right?
Yeah.
Right. Now, you've written several books over several years. Now, you were an Anglican priest, right?
I was, yes.
Okay. And some of the books you've actually became popular were actually books, and I know one I read that I didn't realize you had actually written when you were still Anglican, which is one on feminism, right?
That's right. I mean, that's in many ways one of the ones that caused the biggest splash, because in those days, we're talking about the early 80s, that my book came out in 84.
Right. And that was What Will Happen to God, Feminism and the Reconstruction of Christian Belief.
That's right.
Okay.
And What Will Happen to God was a quotation from a feminist theologian who asked the question, what will happen to God once women take their proper place in society? In other words, will we think of God as Father?
So you saw these things. You saw these things happening in the Anglican Church in the 80s, then?
Well, the thing was, you see, that feminist theology has never had any practical influence in the Catholic Church, but it was having huge influence in the Anglican Church. Now, and the fact is that most of these feminist theologians were Catholics, certainly the most influential.
And not only Catholic, but in the United States, right?
And American Catholic. That's right. But they had great influence on feminists in England, feminists within the Anglican Church, who were militating for women priests. So taking on feminist theology, for me, was part of the whole battle against women priests within the Anglican Church.
Right, and that was one of the first books I ever read having to do with, like, feminist theology.
Yeah.
And becoming aware of it. I remember reading it in the early 90s.
Yeah. I mean, the big question there that's posed, I mean, heresies always bring up some important theological question. The big theological question, which really the Church had never considered, and still hasn't really, except, and I did consider it in my book, but it's not seen as a major problem, is why is God Father rather than Mother? And you have to work through the whole business of the symbolism of the fatherhood of God, and the fact that in Jewish society, in Palestine in the time of Christ, there was a relationship between a father and son, which was quite different from that between mother and daughter or mother and son.
Okay.
There was a relationship of identity. So when our Lord says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," that is something he couldn't have said about his mother. Because there isn't that absolute identity in which the son carries on the identity of the father into the next generation. And I could talk for a long time about this.
Right.
But the theology of an Orthodox theology to counter feminism needs a lot more work on it.
Speaking of another former Anglican priest, John Henry Newman, you wrote a book, or I should say you edited a book by him. Tell us about that.
Well, I edited the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which is his spiritual autobiography, which really explains how he became a Catholic. And it originated as a work of great controversy against Charles Kingsley, the author of The Water Babies, who had simply called him a liar. And he wrote a book saying, "I'm not a liar." And there was a great controversy between them. And Newman published the whole correspondence. He had published attacks on Kingsley. And then he came to the central part, which is his spiritual autobiography. Now, he was so successful in grinding Kingsley into the dirt that in the second edition, he took out of kindness, all the stuff that had really destroyed Kingsley.
Okay.
So I put it all back.
Okay.
Because Kingsley's dead. And I thought, we've got to re-establish Newman not as a kind of watery plaster saint,
right,
but as a really gutsy controversialist.
Right, and I believe his beatification is on the path now, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I think the miracle has been approved.
We've had the miracle for beatification, and
right, so
it looks good for later this year.
Now you're English, but you actually went to school at Trinity College in Dublin. Did that affect your view of Catholicism?
Oh yes, yeah. because for the first time I had seen a real Catholic culture in action, you know. And what I saw was that here was a religion in which ordinary people, the common people, had a spiritual life, which in England they'd been robbed of at the Reformation. And they've been lost to religion ever since. But in England, you could be in, for instance, I mean, one of the first things that really amazed me and impressed me was being in a pub, a very raucous pub down on the docks, full of dockers, and I mean, it was very noisy indeed. Now, in those days, and in fact, probably I think still, before the 6 o'clock news on the radio, the Angelus is played. Now here they all were with their pints of stout, this very dark, strong beer, knocking them back at quite a rate. And suddenly the barman had the radio on for the news. The Angelus sounded through this rough pub. Everybody put down their drinks and bowed their heads while the Angelus was playing. Now, the minute the Angelus was over, the decibel levels were right up again.
Right where they were before.
But that deeply impressed me. It seemed to me that here were these totally uneducated people. And I, who was then an undergraduate, and like all undergraduates, had a pretty fine conceit of myself and of my intellect, I suddenly realized that these people had something in their lives that I had never had.
Let me ask you one question before we leave the Newman book. You know, we always hear that quote about conscience. A lot of people use that as a way of saying, well, I understand what the church teaches, but isn't my conscience supreme?
Yeah.
How do you respond to that, knowing Newman?
Well, because Newman explains in the same document that a conscience must be informed, and that a Catholic conscience must be informed by the teaching of the church. People use the word conscience these days to mean whatever I feel like doing. That isn't conscience. I mean, you know, anybody who's seen Pinocchio knows that. There's Jiminy Cricket sitting on Pinocchio's shoulder, telling him things he doesn't want to hear. That's the voice of conscience. The voice of conscience is quite often, in fact mostly, pretty uncomfortable. You know, the voice of conscience doesn't need to speak if we're doing the right thing.
Right, okay. Now, you also wrote a book which I hadn't heard about called Death of the Anglican Mind.
Well, that was the subtitle of it.
Okay.
It was actually called
The Crockford File?
The Crockford's File.
Okay.
Which was actually a kind of pun on the Rockford Files, which is
okay. Dating yourself a little bit there, right?
Well, no, dating myself, absolutely. But nobody got the reference in England anyway. But I used to love watching that.
Right, the Crockford's File?
Well, the Crockford's Preface, the Crockford's Clerical Directory comes out every year. It's a list of all the Anglican clergymen there are. And there's a preface in, or was, until this happened, every year, which is sort of gently critical of what's going on. Well, one year it was written by somebody called Gareth Bennett, Dr. Gareth Bennett, who happened to be a friend of mine, who wrote a slashing attack. It was anonymous, of course. That's the point. It was anonymous. A slashing attack on the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the whole Anglican establishment. And there was an absolute uproar. It was a front-page story for 10 days. And there was a witch hunt started to find out the author. And I think one or two people guessed it. And Gary lost his nerve and killed himself. And this is a book about how that happened.
Okay.
And I subtitled it The Death of the Anglican Mind, because I think that was something he felt himself, that, you know, we can't carry on the way we're going. And in a way, he was a kind of martyr to that.
Right. And of course, we actually did the interview at Littlemore where Newman was. And at the time we talked, this is going back, almost 6 years now, the Roman option. Now, is this book still relevant?
Well, it is, yes. I think things have moved on, of course. Many Anglicans left. I mean, something like 900 Anglican priests left the Anglican Church. Well, 900 out of about 10,000 is quite a high percentage. About 300 or 400 of those are now Catholic priests. And what was wanted then, or what a lot of Anglicans wanted, was to negotiate an arrangement like that which exists here, in which an Anglican priest with his entire congregation can be received into the church together, and the priest ordained as a Catholic priest. And that has happened to 19 or 20 parishes in the States. It's called the Anglican Use, and they keep the Anglican liturgy. But in England, I think there was no particular thirst for the Anglican liturgy. They were quite happy to use the Roman Mass. They were already doing it anyway. In England, the bishops got a whiff of this and put a stop to it. Cardinal Hume sort of played around with 2 parishes in his own diocese. But that's as far as it went. Now, there was a great sense of betrayal by the English Catholic bishops on the part of all these Anglicans, many of whom stayed and gathered themselves into a kind of church within a church. Now, that, I think, will float off once there are women bishops. And they
Do you think there's another kind of break coming, in a sense,
I think so,
based
yeah.
on that?
And I think they want to come to Rome. And they're going to declare themselves of Catholic faith. They're going to regularize their orders. And they're going to say to Rome, okay, here we are. We've got Catholic orders. We've got Catholic faith. What are you going to do with us?
Right. Now, also, you edited a book, John Paul the Great, maker of the post-conciliar church.
Yeah.
What impact was his papacy on this whole movement in the Anglican Church of people with an interest to reunite with Rome or to join the Roman Catholic
Well,
Church?
I think it was huge because such hopes were raised when he visited England in 1980 or 81. Anyway, early 80s, very soon after he'd become Pope. And we all saw him walking down the aisle of Canterbury Cathedral with the Archbishop of Canterbury side by side. And then both of them kneeling together in prayer before the tomb of St. Thomas a Becket. And that photograph of those two kneeling together gave us all such hope. Because, I mean, those of us within the Church of England who considered ourselves to be of Catholic faith were really working for reunion with Rome. We wanted to hand back the stolen property. You know, there were all these beautiful medieval churches. There was this whole heritage, which had been taken away from its proper owners, in our view. We wanted the Church of England to be Catholic again. And we thought, well, when we saw the Pope in Canterbury Cathedral, we thought, it'll happen in our lifetime. The hopes were really very high. And then suddenly this whole movement to ordain women got underway, really fast.
So how did this book come about? And one of the things that did strike me was your use back then of the title John Paul the Great. Since his death, you hear that much more. But when he was alive, you didn't hear it as often.
Well, I can't take any credit for that, but I think in England maybe I can a bit, because Cardinal Hume used it after. He was one of those who used it after the death, and I think that I had made it current in England to some extent. When I became editor of the Catholic Herald, which is, I think the most influential Catholic newspaper in England. In '98, I think this was. Every newspaper editor has his own little campaigns, and one of mine was to get the idea of John Paul the Great, that phrase, those words, familiar to people, so that it seemed like, well, that's a good idea. It's obvious, So any opportunity I had to write an editorial, I'd slip the words in. There was then a conference was held about the Pope's ministry, in which I gave a keynote address, which I entitled John Paul the Great, in which I explained why this was a relevant title.
And that's the conference in 2001 then?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And then some of the writers, some of the speakers there contributed to this book, and I got others as well.
Right, names some of our people would be familiar with.
These are the leading Catholic theologians.
Right,
Orthodoxy,
Ian Carr, John Sayward.
John Sayward,
the Caldecots. This has Leone Caldecott.
Aidan Nichols
from Birmingham. So some of those are names that our audience might recognize from being on various shows and journey homes that we actually did in England. And so these were basically talks at the conferences?
Well, some of these are talks at the conferences. Others were specially commissioned,
written for
the book.
Well, it struck me too, because we're going to talk a little bit later that this was the Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture that sponsored that.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're also involved with Chesterton, and you've got a book on Chesterton we'll talk about in a minute, right?
Yeah.
In fact, you're in the States because you were at a Chesterton conference, right?
That's right.
Okay. Now, in your section on John Paul the great. I know you quote George Weigel a lot, referring to his view of the Pope, but it's kind of interesting how you kind of take. There's another gentleman's name who has hence passed on, Peter Hebblethwaite.
Hebblethwaite. Yeah.
Who was he?
Well, Peter Hebblethwaite was kind of led the pack against Pope John Paul in England. And his view was that this is this sort of Eastern European bumpkin who's been completely out of touch with Vatican II because, you know, he was cut off from it by the Iron Curtain
kind of thing.
Knew nothing about it. And really, I mean, he's one of these people who sort of seem to regard the Second Vatican Council as the province of Western intellectuals, you know. And he simply thought that here's this man who clearly wants to undo the council, who wants to return the church to the state it was in, you know, the restorationist scenario.
Okay.
And I mean, basically, what I was saying in that paper, in my contribution to that book, is that honestly, 10 years on from Peter Hebblethwaite, it's pretty clear not only that the late Pope did not want to unravel the Second Vatican Council, but he has now become the only authentic interpreter of what the Council actually said. You know, Cardinal Avery Dulles said that. And, you know, we've now reached a state in which, you know, ordinary Catholics, if they want to know what the Council's about, they'll look to what Pope John Paul said, and now what Pope Benedict says, because Pope Benedict is part of the same kind of operation.
Right. Pope consistently refused to accept the view that Vatican II represented a radical break with Catholic tradition.
That's the point, yeah. And which is clear. She's absolutely clear from the documents. But you see, you argue that with these people, and they say, oh, well, we had to accept those documents to get all the reactionaries on board. But the new stuff is what you pay attention to.
Right.
You ignore all the old stuff.
Well, if you can say there's a break, then you can change, right? Because you can separate the continuity. You don't have to reflect back. It's kind of like people who take the Old Testament and New Testament and separate, say, we're New Testament people, so what happened in the Old Testament doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's not true. It's the Bible. It's got both books.
Well, I mean, the church is essentially a church in which tradition has authority. It isn't a biblical church in that sense. The Bible is part of our tradition.
Right. Let me ask you, just because in this, what does the phrase "the immortal words of 1066" and all that mean? Oh,
that's an English joke.
Okay.
There was a very funny spoof history book called 1066 and all that.
Okay.
Which is full of phrases like "such and such a king was a good thing." You know, or a bad thing.
Okay.
Sorry, that was. I suppose knowing that might have an international audience, I might have got rid of that phrase. But yeah, that's what it means.
Well, I remember William the Conqueror. That's the only reason the date that kind of strikes there. And the other thing you attempt in your thing is also to show the great in relation to the other two great popes, Leo and Gregory. Right?
Yeah. I mean, because all three of them had a huge geopolitical importance. And all three have it in common, the fact that they established or re-established the authority of the Pope.
Right.
And Pope Leo in particular established the authority of the Bishop of Rome to speak for the whole Church. Okay. And to define doctrine.
Okay.
But at the same time as that, he was living in very uncertain times. And, you know, I think there's a real parallel there between Pope Leo going north to meet Attila the Hun, to persuade him, we don't know how exactly, persuade him to turn back and not to proceed on to the sack of Rome. In other words, he saved Rome in very much the same way as the late Pope wrote to Brezhnev, who about 1980 actually had the entire Red Army on the borders of Poland to squash Solidarity. And, you know, they had the whole thing set up. It was all, we've now got the plans since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were going to have military courts. They were going to get Wałęsa and all those people in front of them. They were going to be shot against a wall, and a repressive regime of great cruelty was going to be installed. Now, you know, they had the Red Army ready to go. The Pope wrote, and within weeks, the Red Army pulled back because the Pope made it clear, this time you won't get away with it.
Right. And this book is John Paul the Great, maker of the Post-Conciliar Church, which is still in print and available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, edited by William Oddie. Now, there's another book, Chesterton and the Romance of Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Why did you write this book? I mean, there are a plethora of books about Chesterton. Why is this different?
Well, this is different because although there are quite a few popular biographies, none of them had really used the evidence that was there. There are reasons for that. I mean, the Chesterton papers, which are massive, had been sitting in Chesterton's attic at his house in Beaconsfield, which was then lived in by his secretary, who became his literary executor until she died. When she died, the British Library acquired these papers around the year 2000, 2001, and immediately set itself to catalogue this massive, chaotic mass of papers, of letters. There's over 200 notebooks, which he kept throughout his year, quite big fat notebooks with his thoughts, with stories, with drawings, with all kinds of material, priceless stuff. No biographer, no scholar had ever really looked at these. There hadn't been a scholarly book on Chesterton, ever. This is the first book published by a university press. And quite simply, I made a good number of new discoveries in there.
I was going to say, what would be one thing or one or two things that you discovered that you at least didn't realize about Chesterton?
Well, I think it was the intensity of what can only be called a conversion experience after he'd emerged from a kind of period of terrible depressions which lasted 2 or 3 years and which came to a particular peak when he was at the Slade School of Art, training to be an artist, as he supposed. And for all kinds of reasons we don't have time to go in for now, Slade was involved in that, the way they taught, especially Impressionism, the full philosophy of it. He said, persuaded him that we could hardly believe in even the existence of reality and the reality of human life. And he came pretty near to something like a nervous breakdown, and then he wrote to his friends a document which had been published, but nobody had really put it into the context of the new stuff I found, which can only be interpreted as being a letter describing a vision of God. He talks about himself as talking to God as a man speaketh to his friend. It's the authorized version, Exodus 33, I think, talking about Moses talking to God. And he's saying that he's had a vision. He uses the word vision, in which suddenly it becomes clear, mystically clear, that everything is all right. It's almost like the words of Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And after that, he never sunk into these terrible depressions ever again. In fact, after his emergence from them, he had this extraordinary, infectious exuberance that people know him for today. Now, in the papers many of the papers that I discovered, in notebooks and so on, you get clearly there are a lot of little thoughts. I mean, the French call them pensées, brief thoughts, possibly for use later on in writing. And there are poems in which he suddenly says, one very brief poem says, "Have you ever walked along a road thinking that at any turn in the path you might come face to face with God?" That's pretty powerful stuff for a boy of 20. And there's a lot of stuff about meeting God. I mean, one time he says, and the state of mind he's suddenly in, he's so grateful for existence, grateful for the whole of creation, grateful for his own creation, grateful for all mankind, for everything, for lampposts, for streets, for everything. And what you get is this very powerful picture of somebody who's become a deeply spiritual figure. And the point about Chesterton is that he's not one of these saintly people, and I do believe he was a saint, who sort of sucks you in the eye with how holy they are. He simply laughed, I mean, he had a mind absolutely focused on God. But the more he thought of God, the more suddenly he was overwhelmed by joy, which turned into laughter.
Well, if he heard you thought he was a saint, would he laugh?
Oh, he'd laugh. He'd absolutely. No, he would say, for heaven's sake. No. I mean, he's friends of his, people who were close to him said, one friend actually said, he was ministered to by angels. And, you have to say that he was so absent-minded because actually he suddenly had a train of thought. He was a contemplative.
Right.
But he would suddenly become a contemplative crossing the road.
Standing in the middle of the street.
Standing in the middle of the street. There's a famous example of him standing in the middle of the street for half an hour in Fleet Street with cabs, cab drivers yelling at him. And then
just before we go, I wanted to ask you, why do you think he's so popular today?
He's popular. He's more popular here than he is in England.
The States, okay.
In the States.
Okay.
Well, I think having now seen the American Chesterton Society in operation, I think
that's Dale Ahlquist's group. Right?
Dale Ahlquist's group.
Right,
I think Dale Ahlquist has a huge, should be given huge credit for a lot of this.
Programs here on EWTN, hopefully, or
sorry,
on our programs here on EWTN is helping to.
I'm sure it is. I think actually, I do think that one thing I've noticed in previous visits to America is that in America, religion is on the agenda, People are prepared to read a book like Orthodoxy here, and it's the 100th anniversary of Orthodoxy, which is what this conference is about. Indeed, it's one of the reasons I concentrated on the book in my own book.
Okay.
It's the Romance of Orthodoxy, which means the thrilling adventure of Orthodoxy.
Right.
And Chesterton found it was exciting. People use the word orthodoxy to mean something dull. Right. But then I think in America people are prepared to read a book thinking maybe this will change my life.
Right. Perhaps so. Another book in the works for you, or?
Well, this book takes Chesterton's life up to the year 1908.
Okay.
He died in 1936. And people are already getting very pressing, saying, come on.
Where's part two?
Where's part two? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Dr. William Oddie, author of a new book on Chesterton, coming out shortly, Chesterton and the Romance of Orthodoxy. And, of course, John Paul the Great is available right now from the EWTN Religious Catalog. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.